You ready? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for a policy conversation at South by Southwest Education. We're so excited about that. My name is Justin Barra with the Zuckerberg Initiative. This is Seth Gerson from the National Governance Association. And let me waste no time in telling you why you're at the most important session of the afternoon. So in November of 2018, there were 39 governor's races in 36 states and 3 territories. Today, we're mostly going to talk about the state races. That led to 20 new governors being elected, 11 Democrats and 9 Republicans. That means that the split across the country right now is 27 Republican governors and 23 Democratic governors. 20 new governors is a lot, and that means that there's a really interesting moment right now to think about what are they going to be working on and talking about, and what does that mean for the future of education policy. So today in this conversation, we're going to try and cover 3 things. 1, why do governors matter for education policy? 2, what did we learn throughout the campaign about what they were talking about, which may signal something about where the work is going to be going? And 3rd, how have those campaign promises translated into action, at least as signified early by State of the State addresses? Before we talk about that, though, I want to give maybe 1 or 2 other data points as context. So when we think about where education policy might move, one thing I like to think about is where there are trifectas, which to me means where does the same party own the governorship and both houses of the legislature in a state? Right now that exists in 36 states. There's 22 that are owned by Republicans, and there are 22 that are owned by Republicans and about 14 that are owned by Democrats, which means that if there is intra-party alignment, which is not guaranteed, of course, there's a lot of potential that those trifectas may be able to move significant policy. The other data point that's important is there's state chiefs as well, which play an important role in state policy. There were 7 elections this year leading to 2 new state chiefs in California and Arizona. And there's a potential of at least a dozen new appointees, either directly or indirectly, by governors or by state boards, and potentially even as many as 24 new state chiefs that will happen throughout the country just in terms of regular turnover and attrition. That means that there's a lot of new people coming in, and that's something that we want to discuss today. Before I turn it over to Seth to introduce himself, I just want to give one last piece of context for why this matters to us at the Zuckerberg Initiative. So for those of you who don't know, the Zuckerberg Initiative is about a 3-year-old organization. And we wake up on education every morning and think about how do we take luck out of the equation for children, such that every child can be set up for success. And the way we enter the conversation is thinking about the needs of the whole child, which say, if we focus on how children learn, grow, and develop holistically, and we base that in the science of how children grow, learn, and develop, then we may be able to make sure that every child is set up for success through school and beyond. So what that means for the governor's races is certainly it's important what governors talk about, which may translate into policy. But there's a second thing that was really interesting to us, which is potentially, if we saw big macro trends across 36 governor's races in 36 states across parties, that can be a little bit of a barometer for what are people talking about and where are their windows for action. Not always true, but maybe true, that governors are running on things that have wide popular appeal within their state and where they think they may be able to lead to action. And so we wanted to track that and understand what that meant. And so we're going to try and tease out some of that in this session as well. So we're going to share some of the findings for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'd love to take some questions. We are in room 12AB to use the app to submit questions, and we'll go through that at the end. Seth. So want to start, if you could introduce yourself and a little bit about the work of the National Governance Association.
All right, thanks, Justin. And good afternoon, everyone. Seth Gerson, Program Director for K-12 Education, National Governors Association. So it's great to be with you today and talk about the opportunities for governors in education. Just a little bit about the National Governors Association. So we work to support governors in all 50 states and the 5 territories. And we do so by connecting them with each other and connecting them to national and state experts. So in terms of the education division, that means we're connecting them with experts across early childhood, K-12, higher education. And we really create a safe space, a forum for governors to exchange ideas, to share best practices that they're learning in their states, to see what's working and what's not, and to really share that across party and state lines. And we've been doing this for a long time. We have a long tradition of doing this. We began in 1908. Teddy Roosevelt was the first to convene when he was president, the governors from across the country. He was a former governor himself of New York, and he wanted to talk about conservation issues, knew that governors would be key to moving that work forward, so he convened them from across the country. Governors enjoyed it so much that sharing of best practices, that sharing of knowledge, they said, well, we should have a annual meeting. We should have regular meetings of where we can get together on a bipartisan basis and continue discussing policy issues that are pressing across our states. And so 110 years later, here we are. We continue to facilitate those conversations. Just a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C., we had our annual winter meeting. This is an annual meeting growing out of that 1908 time frame. 48 governors from across the country attended, and it was great to just see the spirit of bipartisanship that's present when governors come together, especially with, Justin was just mentioning about the new governors. When you have 20 new governors and seeing them talking to their veteran governors, getting in the mix, learning from a knowledge base, and each session was built on pairs of bipartisan governors leading those discussions. So for education, it was Governor Hutchinson and Governor Inslee. On criminal justice reform, it was Governor Wolf and Governor Bryant. On economic development, it was Governor Hogan and Governor Raimondo. So that sets up this really good exchange between governors and the learning that happens with that. In my 2.5 years with the National Governors Association, I've never once heard a governor or a governor's advisor talk about, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. They really they're problem solvers, and they want to just get things done and learn from the only other 50 similarly situated individuals across the country.
So let's start with the first question, which is, why do governors matter at all in education? So can you talk a little bit about the role that governors play and the levers that they have from the state level?
Yeah, that makes sense, Justin. And so, I think the place I would start on this is to say that nearly 50% of all education funding comes from the state level. So you have a vested interest of the governor in making sure that those dollars are well spent. And in terms of unique levers, one that gets talked about a lot, but cannot be underestimated, is really that bully pulpit. And governors being able to lead the discussion in a state, to shape the dialogue and the discourse around what teaching and learning should look like in a state. I always think of Governor Haslam, the former governor of Tennessee. He didn't have to say much at each education speech that he said, but when he said teachers and leaders are critically important at every speech, that sent ripple effects across the state. The details of that could be taken up by the day-to-day, the state policymakers, the local policymakers, but that spoke volumes to the legislators on both sides of the aisle. That spoke volumes to the educators and the school leaders across the district. So the governor being able to go out, set the agenda, create a narrative for the work that needs to be done across the state is critically important to moving work forward. The second one is convening. The governor oversees so many multiple systems of governance. So not only the K-12 system, but being able to bring into the conversation from the early childhood side, from the higher education, from workforce development, parents, family, communities. You have the state education chief who really oversees that K-12 system, but being able to bring those multiple parties into the conversation, business leaders, critically important. When a governor sends out an invitation, it likely is accepted, and they'll at least come to be part of that conversation. Another one, it gets back to that state control of funding, the governor having a budget, and you're seeing some movement right away from those new governors that are coming into office on budgets being that first place that they can make their mark and put in where they're trying to go with their funding priorities and policies, their education policies and priorities right out of the gate. And the last one, and Justin mentioned a little bit of this, is the appointments. Again, critically important. So many governors have that ability to put in place their school education chief, the person who will be doing the day-to-day work, the State Board of Education, that is so important in many states. So that really drives a lot of the work, and that ability to have that partner in the work is critically important for moving work forward.
So I want to start with the campaign. So we had 6 to 12 months of campaign, 36 states, 72 people-ish running for governor. All different circumstances in those states. Can you talk about any themes that you saw across all of the states? Were there major things that you saw showing up time and time again, regardless of location or even political party?
Sure. So I would say the first thing to start with is to say that education was a part of every single newly elected or re-elected governor's campaign. So that's 36 gubernatorial elections, and the winning candidate in there really talked about education, had it in their platform. We get asked the question a lot, where are the education governors of today? People hark back to that 80s time frame where you had Governor Hunt from North Carolina, or Governor Riley from South Carolina, Governor Alexander from Tennessee, Governor Kane from New Jersey. And what we always say to them is that it was it was a new thing in that time period for governors to be talking about education policy, for them to have it as part of their governing agenda. It was a rare case in the 70s or so for that to happen. Now it's part of all governors' agendas. They may talk about it more on the early childhood side. They may talk about it more on the workforce side, which we saw a lot in this election, or we'll see it more on the K-12 side. But each time is when they're talking about education as part of that. Now, the top 5 issues that we saw in this coming out of the 2018 elections, number 1 was workforce education, things like CTE and STEM and career pathways, early childhood education, teachers and leaders, K-12 teachers and leaders, K-12 finance and education funding overall, and then college access and affordability. But again, so many of these issues had a workforce lens to it. So when governors were talking about their educator workforce, or when they were talking about early childhood education, or social-emotional learning and whole child, which has been a dominant part of this this conference, and I know we'll get to in a little bit, and education funding, how do we keep a strong competitive workforce in our states, was the way governors were approaching these issues. But again, workforce education being that number 1, and we're seeing as new governors come into the office and they're starting their state of the states and budgets, we're seeing investment from at least 9 new governors have put forward proposals for workforce education. Just earlier this month, Governor Bill Lee of Tennessee, the new governor from Tennessee, put forward a $30 million package for CTE, career pathways, STEM pathways in his budget, and really highlighted it in that State of the State address. And going back to that winter meeting, again, really a dominant issue that was discussed among governors. A lot of talk about future of work, addressing the skills gap, something that Governor Bush said earlier this week about really equipping students with the skills to ride the technological wave. We had Steve Case, the founder of AOL, there. Governors engaged him in a conversation of what he was calling the third wave, that really, how do you harness this technology to improve the education of students? How do you bring parents and families and communities, use technology to bring them into the conversation even more? And governors were really interested in that. Again, a highlight of a through line through a lot of the sessions came back to the workforce readiness. In terms of education funding, again, it was a centerpiece of a number of elections, gubernatorial elections. One where we're seeing right out of the gate of where governors are putting down a blueprint for where they want to go on education funding is on the teacher compensation side. We're seeing about, I believe it's around 20 states have moved forward with teacher pay raise proposals. Again, just this week, Governor Lee did. A number of other governors new governors have really put forward proposals. So they talked about, in many ways, a larger lens around teachers and leaders in the campaign, but where they've put that initial capital behind is really seeing pay increases. And I think given the national conversation on teacher salaries that has really occurred over the last year, that makes a lot of sense, but it was interesting to see that they're looking at where can they move first. To Justin's point before about what's the political terrain in their states and where can they get the most buy-in from the legislatures and the state boards of education right from the start? And one of those pieces, in addition to workforce readiness, has really been this teacher compensation.
And that's a complicated one, too, for governors to try and navigate right now. So as I'm sure everybody knows, there were these major teacher strikes that happened last year in more than a half dozen states. And then a lot of governors running on the need for more funding or for higher teacher salaries. At the same time, there were these ballot initiatives in 10 distinct places, 9 states and 1 locality in Seattle, Washington, to either raise additional revenue or give more flexibility in how districts can spend money. And there's very mixed results in those. So there were 6 of those passed and 4 of those did not pass. Interesting, in the places they didn't pass, 2 of the states had major teacher strikes, so in Colorado and Oklahoma. And so I think you see very mixed messages to governors about how to proceed on this, and something that I think we're gonna have to watch closely about how they can translate some of those ideas and campaign promises into action. And certainly workforce is trending right now. It's the issue that seems to be the safest and most eager that people are talking about. So I want to do a deep dive into early childhood education because certainly I think potentially in part because of people in this room, that is one of the issues that has become much more bipartisan over time. So I think maybe 10, 20 years ago, you saw a lot of Democrats pushing for more universal access to early childhood. Now you see much more support on both sides. Can you talk a little bit about what those proposals look like, how much commonality there is, and what it looks like across parties?
Sure, Justin. So the numbers are 34 of 39 governors in the gubernatorial elections talked about early childhood education. So certainly a high, certainly one of the top issues, and 14 of 20 new governors. And what's most interesting, like Justin said, really a bipartisan push on early childhood education. So given those high numbers, you could expect that. And then also that it wasn't just on the pre-K side. It wasn't just about pre-K expansion. You had governors talking about birth to 3, that critical period when children are growing in their brains with the 700 new neural connections being made every second. Really investing in that critical period. They talked about early care and education workforce. They talked about specifically early literacy. So you saw, and full day kindergarten as well. So you saw a real range of governors and where they were talking about early childhood education in addition to such a large number of them. And again, really talking about it as tomorrow's workforce. How do we get children on that pathway to ensuring that they're ready and get to them early, knowing that this is such a critical period. As we go into the budgets and the state of the states, again, governors are looking at this as a real issue, it seems from the get-go, of where they can find some commonality. Again, not just on pre-K expansion, some that were calling for universal pre-K, and let's say in the campaign, now are looking at a down payment, of pre-K expansion. So again, starting on that road. You saw Governor Polis in Colorado really stake right away on full day kindergarten. And what's important about that, if you look at his state of the state, he wasn't just saying, this is my priority for education. I mean, anyone that has followed Governor Polis knows that education's close to his heart. But what he said is, this is my number one priority overall for my first year of my gubernatorial, of my governorship. So really, you saw a number of governors start out that way when they were talking about education. They had it as their top issue, and early childhood was certainly one of those. Governor Newsom in California has also proposed full-day kindergarten. And I think also what's important here of some actions that have already been taken is Governor DeWine and Governor Little. So Governor DeWine in Ohio and Governor Little, both new governors, new governor from Idaho, Governor Little, both have created children's cabinets. So these are cabinets that bring together health and human services and education, early childhood, to really have the agencies coordinating on the best services for children in their early years. So governors that talked about making investments in their early years, they are likely going to proceed to do so, but very interesting to see the infrastructure being built in those states, and in Idaho and Ohio right away. And in Ohio, with Governor DeWine, created in an executive order within his first few weeks, so didn't even wait for the budget, really created that coordination right from the start.
And early childhood is so interesting because there's a range of ways that is coming up in policy, right? Whether it's quality or affordability or access, it might change and the language might be different, but the underlying idea is the same. And as we think about what this signals of what's ripe right now, this is definitely something that I think, as we mentioned, has become more bipartisan, but has attained a lot of really public support across both aisles. And so if you ask the question, there's certainly some polling which signals that 85% of people in the country are supportive of more funding for early childhood education, care, different types of ways to think about children under 5. And that when you cut that by party, there's some polling that suggests that over 80% of Republicans feel that way, and over 90 or even 95% of Democrats feel that way. That there's a real push for more quality and more affordable early childhood care. Whether or not the government plays a role in that is a question for different folks on different sides. But again, people feeling like there's a role for government to engage in, whether it's quality, affordability, or what.
Just one point on that, Justin, because it makes me think of last year, an event that happened that I think is good to point out, where I was going in the beginning about bipartisanship. So this is not just within the campaigns, but Governor Bullock has been advocating for expanding pre-K in Montana for a long time. He's our chair right now at National Governors Association. And when he was looking for what were the best practices in pre-K expansion, the visit he made was to Governor Ivey in Alabama, a Republican governor. Again, getting back to this idea that governors are not just looking for what a fellow Democrat or another member of their party is doing, but looking at where can I go for the best information. And they had a great meeting down there and really were able to go back. And one of the things he did, which we always try to promote, he brought with him the lead legislators that would need to push this through on the legislature to see, again, what do quality pre-K programs look like, and in that way enlist them to anchor the work in them and to be able to move it forward.
Let's do one more deep dive on a topic, and then we'll turn to how this is translated into action so far. So the whole child social-emotional learning had many different variations, is certainly having a moment right now. It's been in a lot of conversations at this conference. The Aspen Commission just released a big report about the importance of focusing on this. I'm wondering if you could talk about how this showed up in governor's races and in what context.
Sure. It definitely came up. Even if it wasn't top 5, we saw a real uptick in discussions of social-emotional learning and whole child. The numbers are 22 out of 36 governors, again, re-elected or new governors that came into office after the 2018 elections. 12 of the 20 new governors spoke about it. And when we're talking about whole child, this has a number of different cuts, not just social-emotional learning, but mental health, wraparound services, parent-family community engagement, community schools, school counseling. Again, a record number likely of governors really that talked about whole child issues during the campaign. And they came at it, and we've seen this throughout the campaign and even before. It goes back to that workforce angle, really seeing that research about the impact of social-emotional learning on employability that Castle and others have done for a number of years. Justin mentioned the Aspen report that pulls a lot of that together. A lot of momentum and recognition on this issue that these skills are needed to really drive academic learning and the kind of results. The other angle that where we see this show up, and especially in these first few weeks of the budgets and the state of the states, is on the school safety side. Certainly, governors looking at not just infrastructure, but also looking at and the hardening of schools, but really looking on the prevention side at mental health, at social-emotional learning and school climate as ways to move this conversation forward. One of the governors that's really driven this forward, that was up for re-election and was re-elected, was Governor Sununu. And he enlisted his Homeland Security advisor, actually, Perry Plummer, who had 30 years of experience in law enforcement. And Perry came to our Governor's Education Policy Advisors Institute last fall. And he spoke about how given his experience, he came into the conversation and the commission that Governor Sununu had set up, really thinking he would put the lever down on gun safety and really put the lever down on the infrastructure changes. But in discussions with Scarlett Lewis and some other advocates, he really came to understand that if you don't tackle the prevention side, if you don't tackle what's happening inside of schools, then you're not going to be able to prevent these incidents going forward. And so Governor Sununu has put a lot of effort up there and has a comprehensive package. Just last month, through, again, the efforts of Scarlett and some others, has declared a social-emotional learning month, a movement. And again, this gets back to the bully pulpit. We may say, oh, well, a month, what is this, right? But it sends a signal. He wasn't just declaring it in a back room. He went out on visited towns throughout New Hampshire and talked about the importance of this and why he had Scarlett Lewis at his inauguration ceremony. Again, that says volumes to the schools and the educators around the importance that he's giving it to social-emotional learning. So again, we've seen around 6 governors since the election, Governor Sisolak, Governor Gordon, Kemp, DeSantis, Walz, and Lee, all talk about school safety, and broad enough, they really give a lot back in their plans to the districts to have the purview, but they're allowing for the space to not only look at infrastructure changes, but money in place to look at some of the prevention pieces around mental health and around school climate. One of the sessions I attended yesterday, and I think is a really important part of this and how we're talking to governors about it, we have a project right now with our health division, our Homeland Security division, and education division, really trying to tackle this issue from a comprehensive approach, is that learning environment, right? That these are inextricably linked, and that it has to be looking at the whole learning environment and the social-emotional learning, and for the social-emotional learning to thrive.
And this is another interesting one where I think there's multiple shades and reasons why it's being pursued. So when I think about whole child translation to policy, it's easy to say that this is focusing on physical health or mental health. And that may be true. There may be things there, maybe social and emotional things. It may be early childhood education. There's a bunch of shades at which this could take place. There's a couple of things that are really interesting to me in how this has played out over the last couple months. So as Seth mentioned, there's an influx right now of dollars for mental health to schools. And that could be in places like Colorado, Wyoming, even places like Texas, because there's just a focus on physical health and mental health as being good for children, objectively, and so focusing on things like breakfast or mental health services, other types of things. And then there are other states where there's dollars for mental health, specifically as a focus on school safety. So we need to deal with mental health as part of a school safety initiative. That's in places like Georgia and South Carolina, Nevada, and others that have been proposed in State of the State addresses. What's interesting for advocates or for schools is those dollars are dollars. It almost doesn't matter the motivation for them. The question is, how do you capitalize on mental health dollars regardless of the motivation at which they come, as long as there's enough flexibility in the policy such that they can be used for things that translate across. And so it's really important, I think, to be tracking responsively the motivation that governors come to these conversations with and why they're pursuing certain policies, but recognize the opportunity to leverage those dollars for the types of work that you think matters the most. The other thing that's really interesting here too is, again, in terms of this being a bellwether issue, we've just started doing some, trying to understand a little bit about where people are on certain issues. And so we've been doing some internal kind of polling and analysis. And what's very, very surprising to me is there's strong support from both teachers and parents for whole child interventions that may not yet be penetrating in other ways. And so I think of 2 things that were really interesting. One is if you force rank parents and teachers among 27 different things, what's most important for kids to be successful? The number 1 things that parents told us, even before reading or math scores, because reading was number 2, the first was mental health of their children. That's the most important thing that parents told us of 27 things matters to them for their children to be successful later on. When you ask teachers, reading was number 1, but the other 4 were whole child things: strong relationships, persistence, growth mindset. And so there's certainly demand growing for those types of interventions among parents and teachers. But a second data point that was really interesting is if you ask in the classroom to teachers and parents what's most important among a range of things, The number one thing that both of them said was the quality of the relationship between the teacher and the student, even more than the quality of the curriculum or the certification or experience of the teacher, which signals that relationships, which is a foundational part of the whole child work, are very important, and parents and teachers both want to see a focus and investment on that quality of the relationship and the time and ways that teachers and students can spend time together. So again, not surprising that this is becoming something that's bubbling up more and more in the education space on a policy side, because we're starting to see among parents and teachers, who are certainly not representative of all voters, but certainly of some voters, a demand for it. So we have a couple more minutes to talk before we turn to questions, and I'm going to start looking through the questions that are coming in. Please keep sending some. But great to run on something that you think you can get elected on, and different to actually translate and put your money behind what you said. And so now I believe almost all, except for maybe one or two, governors have made state of the state addresses and have started to signal budgets and priorities. So talk about how those promises translated into action and dollars.
Yeah. So really, I mean, you're seeing a lot of those priorities shine through from the what was said during the campaigns, but again gets back to this down payment of where a governor's starting, and they're really starting so many times with workforce education, right? So again, looking at how can they navigate their state legislatures and see where they can get some so-called easy wins. Where's the place that they can start to develop the relationship with the people that'll need to move it forward. So you're seeing that workforce education. You're seeing a start on early childhood education. You're seeing a start again on the teacher and leaders side. And I do think that given how it was talked about in the campaigns, as we know as educators and otherwise, it will come back to the investing in the recruitment, the preparation, the professional learning, growth, and leadership of teachers and leaders. But again, with the start being looking at some of these funding vehicles, teacher compensation, school funding, particularly in states where like a Wisconsin or a Michigan, where funding was a big part of the discussion, education funding overall. That's where governors have chosen to go right away. Governor Whitmer, for instance, from Michigan, talked a lot about early childhood education, talked about whole child issues, but she's entering into a state where she also ran on fixing the state's budget. And if you look at her state of the state, that's where she wants to start, particularly on higher education. And again, getting back to this bipartisanship, I think one of the interesting aspects, she came to the winter meeting. She had an interest in higher education in particular. She was already looking with an eye to the state of the state and the budget, and she ended up connecting with Tennessee governor. And one of the pieces that she put in her budget was what she's calling the Michigan Reconnect, which is a model off of Tennessee Reconnect. So a Republican governor developed, initiated proposal in Tennessee. She went to that meeting. She came back and right away put it into action, something that'll work for Michigan and help Michigan students and families.
So we're going to start turning to some questions. So again, please keep submitting them. And we have about 25 minutes. We can kind of have a conversation. So the most upvoted question so far is, I'm going to broaden the question slightly, but is about the difference between the conversation at the state level and the federal level. And so the question is focused around a different conversation that governors are having than the Secretary of Education is having. But it's related to another question here, which is, how is the themes that we're seeing in states different than the themes we're seeing at the federal level? And let me add just kind of one other context on there, which is asked a little bit below, which is, and what about more traditional things that have been debated over the last 10 or 15 years of accountability and standards and others? Certainly, there's less of a conversation of that in states because of the passage of ESSA and the flexibility given to states, and so there's not quite as much of a need to be talking about some of these issues as there was under No Child Left Behind. But can you talk a little bit about the balance of and the difference of more traditional issues and the current ones?
And that's a really good question. This election, there wasn't a lot of talk about accountability or standards or even teacher evaluation like there had been perhaps in the past. Again, big theme issues. And I think your point about ESSA, where we really have worked with governors to see it as one vehicle that they can use for moving forward their education priorities, we could see really some changes there. Even less so from the gubernatorial level, but as governors put in place their new secretaries of education and their state education chiefs, the person who will have that day-to-day implementation overview, purview over the ESSA plans, you may see some shifting there of priorities. So the governor's setting out that vision and working in tandem with their secretary of education. I certainly think that's a vehicle that may change as plans evolve and as new commissioners come into office.
Yeah. And I will ask a specific question, which is a lot of the administration's focus has been more on choice. So I want to ask about that as well. But on the more traditional things like accountability and others, I think there's a really healthy debate about why we're not hearing as much about it. So there are certainly some governors who ran on dismantling certain things that existed before, whether it's an A through F accountability system or basic testing systems, et cetera. There are certainly those instances, but there wasn't as healthy of a debate about Common Core, about testing in general and other types of things. And I don't think there's consensus on why that exists or why that was the case. There is certainly an argument to be made that governors are not focusing on it because it doesn't have wide popular support, and that argument is made frequently that they're not talking about it because they don't want to alienate or polarize the public. There's also an argument to be made that a lot of those things are settled in the way that governors need to address them in the next couple of years, and so they'd rather focus on new areas. And I've seen both arguments being made, and I imagine they play out in different ways in different places. Do you have any kind of examples or evidence where you see something like that?
Just that when we've seen ESSA being effectively implemented, governors that did it really well looked to extend the work they were doing. So a lot of word like innovation are thrown around, but innovation could be having a program in place that you've kept going. In education, that's rare in some ways. We'll stop a program, then we'll start another one. One of the examples that comes to mind is in Iowa. So they've had a teacher leadership and compensation system for since Governor Branstad was in office 2013, and it's still ongoing today under Governor Reynolds. So you've had two different governors, you've had two different commissioners, but they've worked in tandem to really move that work forward. Now they use their ESSA dollars to broaden out that program, extend that program out to more teachers in Iowa. But the teacher leadership and compensation system itself is very innovative. There's not a lot of statewide leadership systems across the country. So using your ESSA dollars to further that extent, we've had interest in governors looking at that system. Governor Cooper convened his state stakeholders from North Carolina this past fall to see what kind of teacher leadership systems he could build out in North Carolina. And interestingly enough, again, from that Democratic and Republican sharing of knowledge, Democrat Governor Cooper beaming in Governor Reynolds and her staff to talk about what's worked well with their statewide teacher leadership system, really helping to direct the conversation in North Carolina about what to look for, what are some of the different developmental milestones that they met, and things to think about before they go into this work in North Carolina.
And let's just talk about choice for a moment as well. So I certainly saw much less of a conversation around charters, choice, private school choice, et cetera, in this election than in previous ones. Fewer state ballot initiatives on charter caps, things like that. Certainly a handful of them in Arizona and other places. But is that something that you saw as well, or do you have a different perspective on how governors were thinking about and talking about choice?
No, I agree. It was not an issue that came up highly ranked, one that governors talked a lot about. A number of governors did. Governor Lee of Tennessee talked a lot about choice. I do believe in his budget and State of the State, he's put some dollars behind that. Governor DeSantis in Florida as well. But I do think this is back to meeting governors where they are. Those governors that talked about social-emotional learning and whole child, or they talked about K-12 teachers and leaders, they're looking at good schools are good schools, and they're looking at that a good charter program will have at its center a whole child framework will be addressing those issues of school climate. They have good leadership development, good teacher development. And so one of the things we're looking for as we move into our projects is really bringing together district traditional schools, charter schools to really learn from each other. Since, again, even governors that may be more reticent around charters, they may have hundreds of thousands of students right now in those schools. And so learning about the best practices of how to strengthen and make sure that there's the outcomes in those schools, whatever school students are going to, is really where the conversation has been from the standpoint of National Governors Association.
So let's turn to a couple of the next questions here, which we'll talk about both higher ed, which we didn't talk about much, and also a little bit of a deeper dive on workforce, which you mentioned is one of the key issues. So first, we focus mostly on K-12 issues here, but certainly higher ed is also having its moment, affordability, privatization of higher ed, et cetera. So can you talk about some of the things that you've seen or where governors are working right now on higher education?
Certainly. So it was one of the top 5 issues was college access and affordability. And you saw a number of governors very much on the education funding side. When they were talking about education funding, they were talking about raising the levels not only for access for pre-K, they were talking about increasing for K-12 education funding, and then also colleges and universities, and also looking at the cost of college, the tuition that students are needing to pay, and wanting to help out students in that way. A lot more campaign discussions about it, not as much on the side of proposals that have come out in budgets so far. The major ways, again, they've moved forward so far in budgets and state of the states is on the funding side overall, that really putting money back on to colleges and universities. I mentioned Governor Whitmer. She's one of the ones that really comes to mind, who in her state of the state, she put a focal point, a priority on higher education as a way to start the conversation in that state of where she wanted to put her capital for her priorities in her budget and in her state of the state.
Yeah. And of course, governors have a slightly different level of responsibility depending on the state over higher ed education than on K-12. And so certainly you're going to see some variance between those given what the unique circumstance of the state is.
And that's another angle that really was talked about, again, as that aligner, that connector of systems that governors are looking at strengthening the connections between K-12, higher education, and workforce development. You did see that a lot in the state of the states so far. Not as much specificity on what that would look like, but governors very interested in making sure that happens and have, again, those tools to be able to do so because they oversee all of those systems. One of the unique levers they have to bring all of those partners to the table and have that conversation about how to align those systems.
So this next top question here, one of the other areas you mentioned, one of the top 5 themes you saw was workforce. And as this question references, there's CTE, career pathways, STEM, high school redesign. There's a bunch of different ways to think about what that is. Can you just talk about what you've seen there? Maybe we'll do a slightly deeper dive on that since it was raised up of any of the key themes at kind of a next level of detail.
There hasn't been as much detail of what that would look like. Again, governors right now, they've done their state of the states. They've put their budgets forward. So it's saying we're going to invest in these in CTE. We're going to expand our programs for career pathways, STEM. One of the governors that really, and he was very vocal about this, that ran on even putting a commercial together for computer science and coding is Governor Hutchinson. And he would say it was the first really campaign commercial where his main commercial was really putting computer science and coding at the center. So you're seeing a lot more governors interested in the computer science coding aspect, looking at Arkansas's model of having state level support. He's deputized a person, Anthony Owen, to really be able to go district to district and help out on a technical assistance side on embedding computer science and coding programs into schools. So I think that's really a way that this will move forward.
Yeah. There's a question lower, which I think is relevant to what you were just talking about. There's kind of two questions. One about access to technology generally, and a second of, there's a theme at this conference certainly about more kind of personalized, equity-driven approaches. How have that played out at the governor level? I will say over the last couple years, I think we've seen a really strong push from governors to be upgrading infrastructure at schools. And it's been pretty universal across states that governors have been eager to do that. And an organization called Education Superhighway has been kind of supporting a lot of governors in their work. And bandwidth has increased over the last 5 years from 4 million students having high quality bandwidth in schools to 44 million, which is something over 90%, I believe, of students with access to bandwidth. And so that's certainly something governors have been putting resources behind, and certainly no governor wants to be left behind of having their schools more outdated. But it wasn't necessarily something I saw much in the campaign of talking about personalized approaches or about using technology more or less in schools. I think the conversation at the campaign level stayed a little higher level. But is there anything that you have seen that kind of ties to some of the themes of this conference around that?
Yeah, I do think that this gets back to the workforce readiness. And governors are sort of grouping it under that umbrella, that how do we harness the technology and use it to develop our students onto career pathways. So it really gets joined up with that conversation.
Yeah. The next top question here about teacher strikes is interesting. So many of the teacher strikes have been calling for more school counselors as something governors are likely to focus on and invest in. What I have seen, certainly, as we talked about kind of the mixed bag in ballot initiatives around additional school funding, you talked about a lot of governors are recommending additional funding to schools. I haven't seen much prescription around some of these issues of how to use that funding from governors. I've seen more, we need to invest more in public schools and teacher salaries broadly. Can you just speak a little bit to that?
No, I think that's right. This is where that translation from the poetry of campaigns into the prose of governing, as Governor Cuomo back in the day, or Mario Cuomo said back in the day, is where there's a change. Certainly a number of governors campaigned on a more equitable funding system, a number on driving some of the efficiencies of funding, and then a number of them just on increasing funding overall for K-12 schools. In this first go ahead, where they've really put the resources really is on increasing funding. And again, I think this gets to, it doesn't mean they're not going to tackle that later in their term, but they want to start the conversation on the number of budget dollars, particularly in states where it was a major issue and you were having the party switch, governors really making that, incoming new governors, a number of states really made that a focal point of their campaigns and wanted to put that down payment of talking about funding, but not getting into some of the more knotty issues of equitable funding or efficiencies. You're seeing this right now. One state that's interesting in this regard is Connecticut, where you have a Democratic governor to a Democratic governor, from Governor Malloy to Governor Lamont. They've had a number of budget difficulties in that state. Governor Lamont spoke a lot about a number of the issues we talked about today, including social-emotional learning, a number of supports for teachers and leaders. But in his State of the State, he said, there's a lot of good things we could be doing, and I want to get to those. But the number one priority for me is to take a look at this budget in our first legislative session and get it fixed up, and then let's talk about the rest of the priorities. So I think that's what we're seeing so far as a trend of where governors are going. Again, that teacher compensation piece, I think they'll get into the conversation about professional growth and learning and leadership and the systems that need to change to align those systems. But that's a lot harder discussion than raising pay, or in a number of states, Governor Sisolak and Governor Grisham both talked about school supplies, right? Providing some reimbursements for teachers that need school supplies. Both are monetary issues, are fiscal, versus some of how do you change the systems to align, which I think are forthcoming.
Yeah. And of course, a conversation about school funding, there's a question here about pensions and the implication there, which is, obviously you can't talk about more funding to K-12 schools if you don't also think about pension responsibilities across the state and specifically for teachers and education. And we see in some states, New Jersey, for example, the governor continuing to make increased payments to the pension system, which is creating less opportunity for dollars to K-12 or other things. Again, not a lot of governors running on reforming pension systems, but certainly that's going to play into conversations about K-12 funding.
Yes, certainly. The state that comes to mind, and this won't surprise most people, is Illinois when I hear about pension reform. And again, very similar to Governor Lamont, where Governor Pritzker in his State of the State address, and again, anyone that's followed Governor Pritzker's career knows that his heart is in early childhood education. And he certainly put a down payment on early childhood education. But again, a governor that came in and said, my first priority is to get this budget in order. A lot of good things that we can cover. I'm certainly going to put a down payment on early childhood education. I couldn't think of it any other way, but the goals that he talked about during the campaign were much more comprehensive, but knowing the difficulties they've had in that state with budgets for the last 5 or 6 years, that's where he's putting his priority.
Yeah. Lots of great questions here, so I'm trying to find a couple that can pull out important themes for what we've been talking about today. I think the next highest question about test-driven accountability, we covered that a little bit, but I think it's an interesting question of, again, rhetoric and what actually happens when governors take office and sort of what the opportunity and control they actually have over that are. So we certainly saw in New Mexico, a new governor elected making strong statements about test-based accountability. We saw the same thing in New Jersey with a governor elected a year ago promising to dismantle a testing system, but so far has not actually moved on that promise yet. But again, haven't seen much focus from governors on should we have test-based accountability or not, in part because of the requirements of ESSA. I know we talked a little bit about that, but just curious if you have anything else to add on testing or accountability more broadly.
Mm-hmm. I think where that makes me think of is just on the bully pulpit side. Again, where is a governor putting their focus? And so you mentioned New Mexico and Governor Grisham. If you saw her introduce her new commissioner, the first thing the commissioner said when Governor Grisham said, we're going to put our focus on supporting teachers. We're going to make sure the schools are funded. We're going to make sure that there's community schools and there's wraparound services. So that's a change, right? And that as a signal to the rest of the state of where are they going to focus, again, not just looking at the governor, but looking at the governor's proxy or surrogate as a way of seeing where the governor is going to lead when you're talking about like something like ESSA, which is past the development side and more in the implementation. That's going to be that commissioner of education who's going to be leading the day-to-day work. But again, a real signal from Governor Grisham in New Mexico to really talk about pay raises, to talk about school supplies, to talk about wraparound services, community schools, some of these larger buckets rather than, as you said, accountability evaluation. And that was a state during the campaign that certainly that came up, and wanting to reverse some of the changes was a focal point of the campaign.
Yeah. So as we near the end of the conversation here, I wonder, could you just talk a little bit about, so you and your team tracked very closely the races. You tracked what governors were saying in speeches, you were tracking what governors were saying in their platforms, in debates, et cetera. And now you're taking that and turning it into personalized supports for governors, as you talk about, where you understand what their motivations and priorities are and figure out how to support them. And just in closing here, can you talk about what to do next? Why is this important? What can advocates do or think about with the information that you're publishing? And can you also just mention some of the work that you're doing to publish some of the one-pagers on each governor on your website and how that might be helpful to folks?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so one of the first steps we did was we developed a gubernatorial transition memo. We did this with a group called Education Council. And so it provides a framework for governors to think about how do you develop your agenda, particularly in the first 100 days, but then even beyond. So not even content-based, but what are the particulars? Who do you need to reach out to in your state, which will be, different in each state, but how to think about what are some of the questions to consider as you're building your education agenda. So we released that last month, and we've been fielding calls from governors' advisors on how they can start their work. Justin mentioned the one-pagers that we did in conjunction with ACT, and these one-pagers they list out the governor's priorities on education from early childhood through K-12 to higher education and workforce development. And they also have data points in each of those places as well. So they have where does the state fall in terms of preschool enrollment, their NAEP scores, their college-going rates, their graduation from college, what's their persistence rates like. So that is where we're using that information to initialize conversations with governors' offices. We're also, just like we talk about with social-emotional learning and school culture, it all comes down to relationships. So with these 20 new governors in office, we are going out to their offices and meeting with them, developing that relationship, making sure they're aware of the services we can provide to help them develop their policy agendas, to help them to convene their key state stakeholders from across the state. We're also, one of the things that we've always done and we will continue to do is to convene them. Again, governors' advisors learn best from each other, and then the national and state experts. So we have a couple of convenings coming up that'll just be education focused. The first one will very much focus on those nuts and bolts, right? Really making the gubernatorial transition memo come alive to really see where do you get started, to connect them with some of their key stakeholders. We're going to bring teams to the convening. And then we'll have a September convening, which will be much more content-based, where we'll focus on early childhood through K-12 to higher education. What are the best practices? Bring experts in. So now that they've gotten a little more into their job, what are some best practices that they can raise up and they can talk about?
And so these one-pagers, where can folks find them?
Yeah, so it's nga.education.org, I believe, education.nga.org. So that's, you can find it there, or you can go to our website, I believe, and you can find it there as well. And these are on a rolling basis. So we started with the incumbent governors, and we are making our way to the new governors as they get settled. We're listing out those priorities. So those will be populated over the next few months. And again, using that information as an engine to really drive some of these education policies forward in the state level.
Yeah, and so I encourage folks to start looking at those as they come in. You all did the work for us to say, what have governors been talking about? What do they care about? And then certainly that's going to translate into a political reality today, but understanding the motivations and passions of governors and why they're entering issues is really valuable and important work. And so appreciate that as a free resource for the ecosystem and for advocates alike. So just want to thank you today for the conversation and appreciate the questions and look forward to continued partnership.
Likewise. And I think that information will really give you a sense, as we talked about today, of meeting governors where they are. So if you're working on social-emotional learning or you're working on K-12 teachers and leaders, seeing where their priorities are, and given how many competing priorities, not just education, but otherwise that they have on their plate, seeing where you can fit those into what they're talking about is really a key to getting into their mindset and moving work forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Seth.